بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه والتابعين لهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. Continuing our discussions about textual interpretation, today we'll be dealing with the issue of basically clarity and ambiguity, that texts can vary in their level of clarity and ambiguity, and so based on that there are certain categorizations of the text. So Imam al-Juwayni, he says, وَالْمُجْمَلُ ما افتقر إلى البيان والبيان إخراج الشيء من حيز الإشكال إلى حيز التجلي والنص ما لا يحتمل إلا معنى واحدا وقيل ما تأويله تنزيله وهو مشتق من منصة العروس وهو الكرسي والظاهر ما احتمل أمرين أحدهما أظهر من الآخر ويؤول الظاهر بالدليل ويسمى ظاهرا بالدليل. So this is the translation. Unclear speech is that which requires clarification. Clarification means removing something from the realm of obscure speech into the realm of clear speech. These are the words of Imam al-Juwayni from the text translation. Explicit speech is known as Nass. So the term for unclear speech is Mujmal. Explicit speech is Nass, and there's some other terms that are coming as well. Explicit speech is that which can have only a single meaning. It has also been defined saying its interpretation is its revelation. Interpretation is its revelation. تأويله تنزيله. The word Nass is derived from minassa, which is the seat of honor of the bride. So basically, when you have a wedding and you have a hall or a gathering place where the women are gathered, and for the bride to be visible so that everyone knows where she is and can see her, she has basically the seat of honor, and it would be something that is an elevated seat, like on a platform or something of that nature. Okay, so these are some examples for Mujmal. Mujmal, I translated it as unclear speech. The translation that I'd given, that I'd shared in the group when the course started, that translation, I think I don't remember which term they used. Either they used ambiguous speech. I think they used ambiguous speech as the translation here. They might have used another expression, but I think they might have used ambiguous speech. And so Mujmal can be something that is ambiguous. It could be characterized as ambiguous or general. Something has been left vague. Vague is a good word. It requires clarification. So, but basically speaking, with Mujmal, the idea is that this is something that it's not possible to implement without further clarification. When we're dealing with ahkam, something that to implement it, it requires further clarification. So the meaning of the words might actually be something that is somewhat clear. So, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Aqimus salah," establish the prayer. The meanings of this are clear. It's not something that is um, unclear in the sense that the meanings of the words are strange and unknown. But for a person who is a new Muslim, or a person who is not Muslim, and is not familiar with how the prayer is performed, there is some ambiguity here. There is some lack of clarity here. Even though the words are in and of themselves, fairly straightforward, but there is an element of ambiguity. There's an element of unclearness. Aqimus Salah requires bayan. It requires clarification. How is the Salah performed? And so the Sharia, the Prophet ﷺ, showed us how Salah is performed. Another example, كُلُوا مِنْ ثَمَرِهِ إِذَا أَثْمَرَ. Eat from the crops when they come to time to harvest. إِذَا أَثْمَرَ, when they're fully ripened and grown. وَآتُوا حَقَّهُ يَوْمَ حَصَادِهِ. And give its haqq, the right that is binding on it, on the day that you harvest. On the day that you harvest. So again, the meaning of the words here is plain. It is straightforward. But to implement this, you must know what is that binding right. What is the share that is binding that must be given? In zakat, if you're going to give zakat from your crops, you have to know how much to give. And that is something that is explained elsewhere in the Sharia, but it's not evident from this text. So the text is in need of bayan, it's in need of clarification. Because of the third example is actually not an example of mujmal. It says, حُرِّمَتْ عَلَيْكُمُ الْمَيْتَةِ. Meita, which is carrion, or meat that has died without being, the animal has died without being properly slaughtered, has been made haram for you. So someone might say, well, this is ambiguous because it has not been made clear what usage of meita has been made haram. It's not clear. However, even though it's not stated, the apparent meaning here, is that it is haram to eat. That's the most obvious thing that comes to mind. When speaking about meita, when speaking about carrion. So it's left unstated. So even though it's left unstated, it's understood. And so it is something that you can, in fact, act on this as it is by taking from this the ruling that meita is haram to eat. Now, are there other conditions for this ruling? Are there exceptions to this ruling? That's something that would be taken from other texts. But the text as it is something that is implementable. The text as it is something implementable. So this would not qualify as mujmal. Like for example, even though it's not mentioned what action is haram relative to meita, like no one is going to come along and say that, well, it doesn't explain the action that is haram here. So it's possible that it means it's haram to eat meita, or it's possible that it means it's haram to speak to meita, like have a conversation with, like a dead animal that you find on the side of the road. That's haram. It doesn't say which actions have been made haram in respect to meita. So we don't know the meaning. No one is going to say that. So حرمت عليكم الميتة is not mujmal. An example of something that is not mujmal because the meaning, the apparent, the intent is understood. It is implied here. Okay, so when it comes to, so again, a mujmal command is a command that requires explanation. Requires explanation. In order to act on it, it needs to be explained. It needs to be explained from something external to it. Every mujmal command that is in the Sharia, that we're required to implement, has in fact been explained. So there's no command that you will find that Allah has given this command, and we don't actually know how to do this. We don't actually know how to do this. So, like for example, there's no obligatory prayer that the Prophet ﷺ didn't tell us how many rak'ahs it is, and so therefore, we don't know how to pray it, and so forth. Okay, and oftentimes it's mentioned that the opposite of mujmal is mubayyan, something that is made clear, and that could be, and they could mean by that it is mubayyan, made clear in the sense that it is in fact clear. It has been expressed in a way that is clear, and so the intent is understood, as opposed to aqimus salah. We don't know from aqimus salah how to perform the salah. But in a text where a command is given, where the implications of that command are understood, that would be mubayyan, because it is already clear. Also, mubayyan could be used in the sense that it has been made clear that a text that has ambiguity in it has been made clear. Someone has made it clear. Mujtahid has made it clear. Other texts have made it clear, and so it is mubayyan in the sense that it has now been made clear. So he says, وَالْبَيَانِ إِخْرَاجُ الشَّيْءِ مِنْ هَيْزِ الْإِشْكَالِ إِلَى هَيْزِ التَّجَلِّي. Explicit speech is that which can only have a single meaning. No. I messed up. I thought I'd fix this, but okay. What is the translation here? Clarification means removing something from the realm of obscure speech into the realm of clear speech. البيان إخراج شيء من هيز الإشكال إلى هيز التجلي. So this act of clarification, this is called bayan. Bayan is the act of taking a text that is ambiguous, that contains ambiguity, it contains vagueness. We're unable to implement it because there's detail that needs to be explained. Explaining that is bayan. That is called bayan. The term bayan can also be used for an evidence that provides clarity. So if you have, for example, aqimus salah, which is vague, establish the prayer. If a person doesn't know how to establish, doesn't know how to perform the prayer, then this is vague. This has been clarified in other texts. This has been clarified in other texts where the Prophet ﷺ has shown how to pray. And he said, Sallu kama ra'aytumuni usalli. Pray as you saw me pray. So This evidence, the reports of the Prophet ﷺ's prayer, hadiths that report how the Prophet ﷺ prayed, that hadith can also be referred to as bayan, because it is that evidence is the clarification of the vagueness that is in the command to establish the prayer. It's important to note that bayan can occur by speech. Allah said, "Atu haqqahu wa atu haqqahu yawm hasadihi." Give the obligatory share that is due from your crops on the day of harvest, the time of harvest. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Fima saqat as-sama'u al-ushr," that crops that have been naturally irrigated, meaning via rainwater, these you give 1/10. These you give 1/10. 1/10 of the crops are due as ushr. Yeah, sorry, 1/10 of the crops are due as zakah. So that's an example. There are other examples that there are other texts that and other details that are explained concerning what is due from crops in various texts. That's an example of the ijmal, the vagueness, being clarified in a text by words, by speech of the Prophet ﷺ. I mean, in this case, it's the Prophet ﷺ, but it doesn't have to be a hadith. It could be another ayah as well. So just as bayan can occur by speech, it can also occur by action. So I mentioned already the example of prayer, and the Prophet ﷺ emphasized that we should learn how to pray from observing his prayer. This was directed to the companions. Sallu kama ra'aytumuni usalli. Pray as you have seen me pray. Now, obviously, this is not addressed to us. It's not an obligation on us to see the Prophet ﷺ pray, because it's not possible for us to see the Prophet ﷺ pray. So it's reported in a hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim that the Prophet ﷺ once he prayed. He stood up on the minbar and prayed, so that he was visible, everyone could see him. And then after he'd prayed, after he'd finished the prayer, he said, "Innama sana'tu hada lita'tammu bi wa lita'lamu salati." The only reason I did this, standing on top of the minbar, because he doesn't want them to think that therefore it's a sunnah to stand on an elevated platform when you pray. That wasn't his purpose. He's saying, my purpose, the only reason I did this, my purpose in doing this, was so that you can emulate me. In other words, you can follow the example of my prayer, and so that you can know how I pray. Another example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, he says, وَلِلَّهِ عَلَى النَّاسِ حَجُّ الْبَيْتِ مَنِ اسْتَطَاعَ إِلَيْهِ سَبِيلًا. Hajj to the house is a binding obligation on mankind due to Allah from whoever is able to perform the Hajj, whoever is able to take the path. So this obligates Hajj. Salah now is something, the example of Salah is something that we see all of us know how to pray. But if you've never made Hajj before, you probably don't know how to make Hajj. So, this maybe is a little bit clear, even a better example, because the majority of us at some point did not know how to make Hajj. Maybe some of you until now have not made Hajj, and so you're not very familiar with how to perform Hajj. And even if you've studied the fiqh of Hajj, I can say this from experience, even if you studied the fiqh of Hajj, until you actually perform Hajj, it can, it can be a little bit. You can mix things up and forget things. So you have to perform Hajj to really know how Hajj is performed. Because the theoretical study needs also the practice in putting it into practice. So the Prophet ﷺ, it's important to note that obviously the Arabs were already performing hajj in Jahiliyyah. Because hajj was something that they'd inherited from Ibrahim alayhi salam. However, they had distorted the Sharia of Ibrahim alayhi salam. So some things that they were doing were incorrect. Obviously, they were mushrikeen. So I mean, one of the most important things they were doing was incorrect. From the very get-go, they would say labbaik Allahumma labbaik, labbaik la sharika laka labbaik illa sharikan huwa lak tamlikuhu wa ma malak. Basically adding to the talbiyah to justify their shirk. And then a host of other things that they changed or distorted. Also, along with that, you have that the Prophet ﷺ could legislate and establish sunnahs that are additional to what was in the time of Ibrahim alayhi salam. So it's not necessarily that everything the Prophet ﷺ was doing is coming directly from Ibrahim alayhi salam, but no doubt he was correcting these distortions. They had an idea about how to perform hajj, but obviously the way that they had learned to perform hajj was that was inherited from mushrikeen. They were themselves were mushrikeen, and all the Sahaba were making hajj when the Prophet ﷺ made hajjatul wada. All of them had been mushrikeen until recently. So they've been making hajj as mushrikeen. They didn't learn the hajj from the Prophet ﷺ. So they had an idea about how to perform hajj, but they weren't sure about the details. They weren't sure what they were doing was correct and what was not correct. It was something that would have been obvious. I mean, when somebody became Muslim, you wouldn't have to tell them that, that you don't affirm partners for Allah in the talbiyah. That would go without saying. But what is the sunnah for doing talbiyah? That's something that they would have learned from the Prophet ﷺ. And likewise, the many details of hajj they learned from the Prophet ﷺ. And so the Prophet ﷺ, he addressed them saying, "Khudhu anni manasikakum." Take the rituals of hajj from me. In other words, as hajj proceeds from one step to the next, follow me. Look out for what I'm doing and emulate my actions. So the Prophet ﷺ explained many of the rulings of hajj in words as well. But he explained them in actions. And so the Sahaba would follow him and emulate his example. And indeed, many of the rulings of hajj are in fact taken from actions of the Prophet ﷺ. Concerning Salatul Kusuf, the Prophet ﷺ, he said that when you see these signs, the moon or the sun being eclipsed, إِذَا رَأَيْتُم مِّنْهَا شَيْئًا فَصَلُّوا, then pray, then perform prayer. But Salatul Kusuf, as you know, has a very specific fashion in which it is performed. We don't have any hadith from the Prophet ﷺ where he says, when you perform Salatul Kusuf, it is performed in this fashion. You do this, then this, then this, then this. What we have are reports of how the Prophet ﷺ performed the Salatul Kusuf, and from there is taken the rulings of how Salatul Kusuf is supposed to be performed. From this bayan by action of the Prophet ﷺ. So just coming back briefly, I mentioned that you have Mujmal, and we gave examples of Mujmal, and said that the opposite of Mujmal is Mubayyan. Mubayyan is something that is clear in itself. It doesn't require clarification. Perhaps an example of this would be the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Al-Jannatu la yadkhuluha illa nafsun muslima. That Jannah will only be entered by a Muslim soul. In other words, none will enter Jannah. None will enter Jannah except a Muslim soul. So someone who's not a Muslim will not enter Jannah. This is self-evident and doesn't require bayan. Okay, so then the Imam al-Haramain states for explicit speech. Explicit speech or Nass is that which can only have a single meaning. It has also been defined saying its interpretation is its revelation. Tanziluhu, ta'wiluhu, tanziluhu. And the word Nass is derived from Minassa, or the seat of honor of the bride. Okay, so he's defined here Nass as that which has only one possible meaning. There's only one possible meaning. لا يحتمل إلا معنى واحدا. النص ما لا يحتمل إلا معنى واحدا. The Nass is that text that cannot have except one meaning. This is also can be expressed as ما دل على المعنى دلالة قطعية. A text that indicates its intended meaning in a fashion that is definite, قطعي, يقين, with absolute certainty. So this is the idea of Nass. Now, with the term Nass, it's important to note that this is the usuli meaning of Nass, but the term Nass is oftentimes used to mean texts. So the plural of Nass is nusus. So the texts of the Quran, the texts of the Quran and the Sunnah are the nusus. And you might find in certain contexts when someone is quoting a particular scholar, for example, they'll say, هذا نص كلام الإمام al-Juwayni. These are the exact words of Imam al-Juwayni. It's a quote of the words of Imam al-Juwayni. So Nass means text. It doesn't have to be explicit. It just means text. So all of the ayat, in that sense, all of the ayat of the Quran are nusus. All the ayat of the Quran are nusus, texts. It's important to understand the meanings of these terms in the context in which they are used. So, for example, there is a principle that is oftentimes mentioned by the usuliyin, which if you don't take note of the context, you might misunderstand it. لا اجتهاد في مورد النص. On an issue for which there is a Nass. Remember what we said was the usuli meaning of Nass, an explicit text that cannot have but one interpretation. Not possible for it to be understood in any other way. لا اجتهاد في مورد النص. That ijtihad is not valid, is not accepted on an issue for which there is a Nass. Why? Because this text is not open to interpretation. It's not open to interpretation. In other words, it is qat'i, it is decisive. It is decisive evidence. So what this principle is saying is that when there is decisive evidence, qat'i evidence, yaqini evidence on a particular issue, any ijtihad that is saying otherwise on that particular issue is invalid. That's the hadith fi mawrid an-nass. What happens is you might find some people not understanding what is intended by this term, Okay. There's no ijtihad في مقابلة النص. There's no ijtihad against the text. And so anywhere they find a text and they think that the text has a particular meaning, you might find them saying, لا اجتهاد في مورد النص. There's no ijtihad here. You're going against the text. You're going against the sunnah. The dalil is clear, ya akhi. Whereas the particular evidence might be open to interpretation, and if it is open to interpretation, you have to consider what are the other evidences of the issue. It's important to understand these terms, where they're used, what is being intended by them. Another important example of this is you have Imam Shafi'i in al-Risala. Imam Shafi'i in al-Risala, he uses the term Nass. But Imam al-Shafi'i was writing before this terminology developed. Istilah, the term Nass as defined here, this is an istilah. It is a technical usage. It is technical jargon that developed as a convention amongst the usuliyin. In Imam Shafi'i's time, this convention did not exist. So he uses the term Nass in a fashion that essentially extends to the meaning of Zahir. So the meaning of Zahir is covered by Nass. Okay, so he goes on to say it has been defined. It has also been defined saying its interpretation is its revelation. Ta'wiluhu tanziluhu. Its interpretation is its revelation. This is not, a proper definition according to the custom of the usuliyin, which follows the conventions of ilm al-mantiq, of logic. Because the logicians have laid out certain conventions for what constitutes a proper definition. These conventions are generally followed by the usuliyin. Here he's mentioned a definition that doesn't follow that. It's giving a metaphorical explanation to give you an idea of what is meant. Its interpretation is its revelation. What does that mean? Basically, what those who use this expression, what they meant is the mere revelation of its words, because it's not open to interpretation, it is as if it's already been interpreted. So its revelation is its interpretation. Then finally, he goes on to say the word is derived from minassa. This is not technically true because actually the reverse. It's actually as a grammatical point. It's actually the reverse. The word minassa is actually derived from nass. But this is the idea: is that these words are related, and this understanding the meaning that is here allows you helps you to understand what is intended. So basically, Nass and the various meanings that come from it, that are derived from it, typically will have something to do with raising something up, or taking something to its pinnacle. And so then the idea here is that the text that is explicit, such that it has no other possible meaning, it's as if it towers over all the other levels of types of speech. And so you can sort of see the relation here. Okay, so some examples. قل هو الله أحد. This is a Nass. Allah is one, is unique. أيها الناس قد فرض الله عليكم الحج فهجوا. O mankind, O people, this is hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. O people, Allah has made hajj fard for you, so perform hajj. So, how is this an example of Nass? What makes this a Nass? In what sense are we saying that this is a Nass? أيها الناس قد فرض الله عليكم الحج فحجوا. Anyone? Any takers? Okay, so when the Prophet ﷺ says أيها الناس قد فرض الله عليكم الحج فحجوا, then this is explicit that Hajj is a binding obligation. So there's no possibility that Hajju here means, it would be a good idea for you to make Hajj. You'll be rewarded if you make Hajj. You're encouraged to make Hajj. But it's not necessarily binding. The fact that he said, Faradallahu alaykum, this eliminates all alternative possibilities. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, he says, فَمَنْ لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَإِطْعَامُ سِتِّينَ مِسْكِينًا. This is in context of kafara for dhihar, the expiation for dhihar. You go through certain things, and then he says, whoever is not able, then he should feed 60 people, 60 poor people. So the fact that he says 60, this is a Nass. 60 can't be 59, it can't be 61, it's 60. Okay, so now we have an interesting quote from Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni. The concept of Nass revolves around eliminating ihtimal, eliminating possible meanings beyond the immediate meaning, most obvious meaning. But there's a question, what about ihtimalat, or possibilities that are clearly not intended or absurd? So for example, the Wafd of Najran, the Christian delegation that came to the Prophet ﷺ from Najran, when they discussed with the Prophet ﷺ, and he called them to Islam, they said, well, they found verses in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses we, uses we, nahnu, or inna. And they said, see, Trinity. This is absurd. It's far-fetched. It's ridiculous. It's clearly not a possible. It's a possibility in the text, but it's not a possibility. The word we could possibly be used by a triune God. So it's a possibility. But it's also not possible. It's absurd. Because anyone who reads the Quran knows this is not intended. And basically, how does that go? Firstly, if you believe the Quran is revelation, as Muslims who believe the Quran is revelation, is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has very clearly told us throughout the Quran that He is one. So clearly, this is not intended. It doesn't. It's absurd to even suggest it. Even if someone does not accept the Quran is revelation, they have doubts about it being revelation. Even if he thinks that it's fabricated by Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Or as some Western academics, some Orientalists argued that maybe the text of the Quran, it goes back to Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, but it continued developing even after him, and it settled at some point after him in the form that we know it today. So there could be multiple authors of the Quran, regardless of whatever the case is. Anyone who reads the Quran as a text knows that the author of the Quran, who says Muslims, we have no doubt that the Quran is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But for someone who does have doubt, he still cannot objectively read the Quran and think that it's even a possibility that the author of the Quran intends the Trinity. It's absurd. So now the question is, these sorts of absurdities, or these sorts of ridiculous possibilities that are possible in the text, but simply not intended. We know that they're not intended. And there is no compelling evidence aslan that they are intended. Do we call this a Nass or not? So Imam al-Haramain, he has an important quote here. I think, let me hold off on that. Let's get back to it. Okay. The translation of this. I think while I was making this slide, I did something in the translation of this part about Zahir sort of disappeared. Just can't get a break today. I know I translated it. But I don't know where anyways, fine. Imam al-Haramain, he says, الظاهر محتمل أمرين أحدهما أظهر من الآخر. What is Zahir? Zahir is when we have apparent speech that has an apparent meaning. And what that means is محتمل أمرين. It has two possible meanings. It doesn't actually have to be two, it could be multiple possible meanings. It says أمرين. So it has multiple possible meanings. One of them is more apparent than the other meanings. One of them is more apparent than the other meanings. But this is really nothing in my head. I know I translated this, but I have no idea where that text is now. So, Zahir is an apparent text that has an apparent, it's a text that has an apparent meaning, which has other possible meanings, other possible alternative meanings, but those alternative meanings are likely not in, they're less likely. ويؤول الظاهر بالدليل ويسمى ظاهرا بالدليل. The Zahir, the apparent, can be interpreted, can be reinterpreted. Ta'wil, يؤول here basically is coming from ta'wil. Ta'wil in the context of usul al-fiqh means to interpret a text that is Zahir, a text that has an apparent meaning, but it has other possible alternative meanings. Ta'wil is the act of reinterpreting that text to say that, in fact, this apparent meaning is not the one that is intended here. This other meaning is intended here. And it requires dalil. It requires dalil. There must be evidence for that. You cannot simply make that claim without evidence. ويسمى ظاهرا بالدليل. This is called ظاهر based on dalil. So the mu'awwal, which is the alternative meaning, when it is backed up by evidence, we would say that this is what is apparent, but it's apparent not in light of the text in isolation, but it's apparent when you take the text in consideration with other evidence. So this is ظاهر. This is the meaning of ظاهر. We'll come back to this quote from Imam al-Haramain. So now, when you have a text that has a ظاهر, it has an apparent meaning, while there are other possible meanings. There are certain issues that come up. How do you interpret such a text? So there's some terms here that are important. The first one is Zahir, or Zahir, actually. The Zahir is basically, when we speak about the Zahir, we're speaking about words that have an apparent meaning. Other meanings are possible. Then we have Ta'wil. Ta'wil is the act of interpretation where you are prioritizing one of the less apparent meanings. And this act of ta'wil, to be valid, it requires evidence. And then we have a term that is called mu'awwal. This is not mentioned by Imam al-Haramain in the text, but it's oftentimes used to refer to the text that has been reinterpreted away from its apparent meaning. And so ta'wil is sometimes, it's described as averting the text from its apparent meaning to one of its less likely meanings, one of its alternative meanings. So when we speak of something, a text that is mu'awwal, the mu'awwal text is a text whose apparent meaning is not intended. It is the text that has been reinterpreted, and there is evidence for this reinterpretation. Again, concerning this term, it's important to know that these terms, that you have to understand them in light of context. The term ta'wil is not always used in this particular meaning. This is its technical meaning in the context of usul al-fiqh. So this is a technical definition that the usuliyin have for ta'wil, that it is صرف اللفظ عن ظاهره إلى معنى مرجوح بدليل. That you're averting the text from its more apparent meaning to a less apparent meaning based on evidence. This is how ta'wil is used in this context in usul al-fiqh. But the term ta'wil is not necessarily limited to this. So you will frequently find that ta'wil is used simply to mean tafsir, explaining something, explaining a text, and particularly obviously in the context of the Quran. So Ibn Jarir al-Tabari, in his tafsir, he frequently uses this meaning of ta'wil. In fact, he refers to the authorities of tafsir from the Salaf, from the Sahaba and the Tabi'in. He'll oftentimes call them Ahlut Ta'wil, the people of Ta'wil, meaning the people who are authorities in interpretation. So the act of interpretation oftentimes includes saying that this text is a Nass. It has no other possible meaning. It includes saying that this text, the Zahir, is indeed intended. All of that is part of Ta'wil. In its broader linguistic usage. So Imam al-Tabari is simply using it in its linguistic usage. So when you find him, or possibly other scholars sometimes using the term ta'wil basically to mean tafsir, to mean interpretation, regardless of whether a less apparent meaning is being adopted or not, don't misunderstand that. An example of this we find in the Nusus. The Prophet ﷺ, he made dua for his cousin, Ibn Abbas, who was a young lad at the time. Allahumma faqihhu fi ad-din wa 'allimhu at-ta'wil. Oh Allah, give him understanding of the religion and teach him ta'wil. And teach him the interpretation of the Quran. So, based on this discussion, we have the Nass, and we have the Zahir, we have the Mujmal, we have al-Mu'awwal. Based on this, we can say that when it comes to interpreting texts, there are certain steps that you need to take. Firstly, on examining the text, you need to determine what are the possible meanings. Perhaps there's only one possible meaning, in which case this text is a Nass. Perhaps there are multiple possible meanings, in which case you need to determine if there is one meaning that is more apparent. You need to determine if there is one meaning that is more apparent. That apparent meaning then is the Zahir. That apparent meaning is then the Zahir. You need to investigate, are there evidences, further evidences concerning this issue, on the basis of which we would say that this Zahir is not intended. This Zahir is not intended. Also, to tie this back to some of the previous discussions that we had in other topics of usul al-fiqh already related to textual interpretation, we talked about umum and khusus, texts that are general and specific. So a text that is am, its zahir, its apparent meaning is that it applies to everything that falls under the general meaning of the text. And doing takhsis of it then, specifying exceptions to it, this is an act of ta'wil. We talked about the view of the majority of the usuliyin is that al-amru al-mutlaq yufidu al-wujub. That when you have the to-do form, the imperative form, if'al, by itself, the command form, by itself, it indicates wujub, it indicates obligation. This is the zahir. So when you have a command, form, an imperative, the zahir of this, the apparent meaning of this is wujub. This is based on what we said was the opinion of the majority of scholars across all the madhahib, that this is wujub. So this would then be the zahir of the amr, of the command, wujub. And so alternative interpretations, such as saying that this is mubah, this amr is intended to indicate ibaha, permission, it's intended to indicate recommendation, nadb. This would be the less apparent meanings. And so saying that this amr is intended, basically the determination of the mujtahid that this amr actually is intended as nadb or as ibaha, this is ta'wil. And so it requires dalil, because you're doing sarf al-lafz an zahirihi, which is ta'wil. Okay, so now going back to the quote of Imam al-Haramain. Imam al-Haramain in al-Burhan, this is paragraph, basically he's the segments of the text, Imam Sheikh Abdul-Azim al-Dib in his critical edition has numbered them. This is number 315, which I've incorrectly labeled as 350. Just full of mistakes. slides. He says, addressing this dilemma about far-fetched possibilities, do they render text Zahir, or can we say that these don't count and so therefore they should be counted as nusus? They should be counted as Nass, explicit. He addresses this question. He says, ثم اعتقد كثير من الخائضين في الأصول عزة النصوص. Many of the scholars who have discussed usul are of the belief that nusus, meaning explicit texts, are rare. To the extent that they say, إن النص في الكتاب قوله عز وجل قل هو الله أحد وقوله محمد رسول الله. To the point that they will say, what are explicit texts in the Quran? قل هو الله أحد. This is an explicit text. محمد رسول الله. This is an explicit text. وما يظهر ظهورهما. And anything that is as obvious as these examples. Anything less than that, basically, he's saying basically the idea is that you have a group of usuliyin who their conception of this issue is that explicit texts in the Quran are extremely, extremely rare. Very few examples that are as clear as can be, that are not open to any sort of interpretation. And anything that is not as clear as these, basically they'll say, well, this has an alternative possibility, this has an alternative possibility. ولا يكاد هؤلاء يسمحون بالاعتراف بنص في كتاب الله وهو مرتبط حكم شرعي. He says that this group of scholars will hardly ever acknowledge a text that is in the Quran is in fact a nas, it is in fact explicit, so long as it is related to a hukm, a ruling. Basically, the texts that are related to rulings, almost all of them, if not all of them, are, in the perception of this group, they don't rise to the level of nas. At best, they are zahir, because there's always some possibility that is there of an alternative meaning. وَقَضَوْا بِنُدُورِ النُّصُوصِ فِي السُّنَّةِ. And likewise, they said about the sunnah that actual nusus are rare. حَتَّى عَدُّوا أَمْثِلَ مَعْدُودَةً مَحْدُودَةً. To the extent that they will count just a few very limited examples. This is about all there is. Like, for example, the Prophet ﷺ, he said to Abu Burda concerning the udhiyah, the slaughtering, when he slaughtered basically before the Eid prayer, he said, تُجْزِئُكَ وَلَا تُجْزِئُ أَحَدًا بَعْدَكَ. He said, okay, this will fulfill your obligation, but it won't fulfill for anyone after you. This is very clear, it applies to Abu Burda. There's no room for interpretation. وقوله عليه السلام وَهْدُوا يَا أُنَيْسِ إِلَى امْرَأَةِ هَذَا فَإِنْ اعْتَرَفَتْ فَارْجُمْهَا. Go, O Unais, to the wife of this man, who is basically suspected of adultery. If she confesses, stone her. So basically, this is a very specific case. Prophet ﷺ has addressed a specific person, talking about a specific woman, giving specific instructions. No possibility here. There's no alternatives here. So, what does Imam al-Juwayni think of this approach? He says, هذا قول من لا يحيط بالغرض من ذلك. This view is the view of someone who doesn't understand the point of this discussion. المقصود من النصوص الاستقلال بإفادة المعاني على قطع مع انهسام جهات التأويلات. The purpose of So he says المقصود من النصوص الاستقلال بإفادة المعاني على قطع. The purpose of the function of nusus is that they independently produce meanings that are certain. مع انحسام جهات التأويلات. Well, all possibilities of ta'wil are eliminated. All possibilities of ta'wil are eliminated. وانقطاع مسالك الاحتمالات. All routes to alternative possibilities are cut off. وهذا وإن كان بعيدا حصوله بوضع الصيغ ردا إلى اللغة، فما أكثر هذا الغرض مع القرائن الحالية والمقالية. Says, even if we're looking at individual words just in isolation as they are according to the original linguistic coinage of the terms that has these different possibilities, and that these expressions have these different possibilities. However, this purpose is achieved in many texts when you take into consideration contextual clues or textual clues, قرائن حالية and مقالية. So either in situational, contextual, or in the text. وإذا نحن خذنا في باب التأويلات وإبانة بطلان معظم مسالك المؤولين، استبان للطالب الفطن أن جل ما يحسبه الناس ظواهر معرضة للتأويلات فهي النصوص. Is that when we explore this idea of how is ta'wil made, and showing that most of the paths for ta'wil are basically useless, it will become clear to the intelligent seeker that most of the texts that many people consider to be dhawahir is plural of dhahir, that they consider to be merely dhahir and open to interpretation, mu'arrada lit-ta'wilat, are actually nusus, they're actually explicit texts. وقد تكون القرينة إجماعا. The qarina might be an ijma'. The qarina might be a rational necessity. أو ما في معناهما, or something else of that nature. So there's a number of in any case, point is that qara'in and looking at siyaq, these things indicate what is intended clearly. It's worth noting that Imam al-Juwayni in al-Burhan, when listing definitions for Nass, one of the definitions that he gives, and he seems to approve of it because he doesn't mention any, he mentions objections to it, but he doesn't really like the objections. He mentions two definitions actually. One of them, he says, لفظ مفيد لا يتطرق إليه تأويل. A lafz that gives meaning, لفظ مفيد, that is not open to interpretation. It's not open to interpretation. In other words, there's no valid alternative interpretation. The apparent meaning, the obvious meaning is the only possible meaning, because the ta'wilat that are being considered have no basis whatsoever. Remember that ta'wil requires dalil. Ta'wil requires evidence. Also, in the same context in his discussion, he actually mentions the example of فَلَا تَقُلْ لَهُمَا أُفْ وَلَا تَنْهَرْهُمَا. Do not even say to your parents "uff" and do not rebuke them. He says that this is explicit. He says that we know from the context that the intention of this is to be good to your parents, and it's a prohibition of being bad to your parents. It's an encouragement to fulfill the rights of your parents. It says that so this context makes this verse an explicit prohibition concerning, not just concerning these things, but even it's explicit concerning the prohibition of beating them. even though it's not mentioned. And even though you could say فلا تقل, لا تقل is نهي, النهي المطلق يفيد التحريم إلا ما دل الدليل. So خلاص, he says no, this is nonsense. This is nonsense. This is explicit. This is explicit. We know it's explicit not from simply looking at the sort of the linguistic conventions and rules and structures, but understanding the text in its context and its intent. Imam al-Ghazali also acknowledges in al-Mustasfa that there's sort of these two approaches to Nass. Says the more famous one is ما لا يتطرق إليه احتمال أصلا لا على قرب ولا على بعد. The more famous usage is that Nass is ما لا يتطرق إليه احتمال. There is no other possible alternative. Not something that is reasonable, nor something that is far-fetched or absurd or what have you. كالخمسة مثلا فإنه نص في معنى. So for example, the word 5 is a nas concerning its meaning. It can't be 6, it can't be 4. Likewise, the rest of the numbers. Another example, he says, when you say horse cannot be a donkey, it cannot be a camel, and other things like that are of this level. These things are called nas. This is the popular approach. Then he says, the other approach, he actually mentions three things. The first is, he says, Imam Shafi'i, back to before the convention developed. So this is basically two alternatives. The second one is التعبير بالنص عما لا يتطرق إليه احتمال مقبول يعضده دليل. أما الاحتمال الذي لا يعضده دليل فلا يخرج اللفظ عن كونه نصا. So this alternative approach, which is basically what Imam al-Haramain is advocating here, is that Nass can be applied to any text that does not have a valid or reasonable alternative interpretation supported by evidence. As for possibilities that are in the text that are not supported by any evidence, these don't make the text, these don't remove the text from being a nas, from being considered explicit. In any case, he goes on to say that he prefers the more popular approach. He says because if we take the second approach, that the line between Nass and Zahir starts to get blurred. But I think Imam al-Haramain's point here is important to understand in terms of, because this difference that they're discussing, it's a terminological difference, it's a semantic difference. However, it's important to note that the texts that rise to the level of being qat'i, even if it's based on looking at external qara'in, external indicators, are many. There are many. It's not, as has been suggested by some, that they're very so few that they almost don't exist. After that, whether you choose to call it Nass or you choose to call it Zahir, this is a semantic discussion. Also, this is important to note because you might find scholars using it sometimes this way, calling something Zahir in light of Imam al-Ghazali's favorite opinion concerning the terminology, or another scholar calling it Nass based on favoring Imam al-Juwayni's approach. And so you might read those texts and assume that these scholars are differing, when in reality they're not. They just are using the terminology in a different fashion. Their actual assessment of the text and the possible meanings that it has, and how they've arrived at that might actually be the same. Um, okay, so with that said about Zahir and Mu'awwal and Nass and Zahir, Nass and Mujmal, it's worth asking a question. Can a text be Nass, Mujmal, and Zahir at the same time? Anyone? Can a text be a Nass and be Mujmal and Zahir at the same time? No takers on this? I mean, if we have a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ or an ayah in the Quran, can that ayah be said to be a Nas and Zahir and Mujmal at the same time? Does that make sense? Does it make sense for them to be Nas and Zahir and Mujmal at the same time? Okay, so Imam al-Ghazali, he says, يجوز أن يكون اللفظ الواحد نصا ظاهرا مجملا. It's possible for a single expression, a single statement, to be a nas and a ظاهر and a mujmal, لكن بالإضافة إلى ثلاثة معاني. But in respect to three meanings that are present in that text, not in relation to the same meaning. لا إلى معنى واحد. So if we take a look, some of the examples that we discussed. أيها الناس قد فرض الله عليكم الحج فهجوا. Oh people, Allah has made hajj obligatory on you. This is a nas. فرض الله عليكم الحج فهجوا. It's a nas concerning the obligation of hajj. But it is mujmal concerning the manner in which hajj is performed. This is both nas and mujmal at the same time, but in respect to two different meanings. So it's a nas in respect to the ruling, which is obligation, binding obligation. And it is mujmal in concern as it concerns the actual manner in which it is performed. See another example. فمن لم يستطع فإطعام 60 مسكينا. So the number 60 here is nas. It has to be 60 poor people. But what falls under miskeen, for example, could be said to be zahir. For example, obviously scholars will differ as to who might qualify to be miskeen. If that's the case, then one of those meanings would perhaps be the apparent meaning of miskeen. How do you actually identify miskeen? And at'am, I think at'am could be said to be zahir here. It could be said to be a nas that you have to give food. So you can't give them money. You have to give them food. You have to feed them. You can't give them clothes. You have to feed them. But it is, one might say that it is zahir in that you can give them any amount of food. You might go around handing out 60 Tootsie Rolls. Fed them. But that's most fuqaha probably said that doesn't really count. That's not sufficient. Even though you fed them. So the Zahir of this is that that is feeding. It falls under that. I don't know, maybe somebody might say that that's not even the Zahir, but regardless. So in any case, the idea is in any case, the idea is that a text can be Nass and Zahir and Mujmal at the same time in respect to different meanings. Okay, so now to sort of wrap up, I want to look at a sort of an example, an illustrative example as a case study for Zahir and Mu'awwal. We have this hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari. It's also in Sahih Muslim. I believe it's in Sahih Muslim as well. In Sahih Muslim as well, and many other collections. عن أبي سعيد الخدري رضي الله عنه أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال الغسل يوم الجمعة واجب على كل محتلم. Abu Sa'id al-Khudri reports the Prophet ﷺ said, bathing on the day of Friday is wajib on every adult male. We're going to take a look at the word wajib here. But before that, very quickly, it's worth noting, kulli muhtalim. What does muhtalim mean? What do you understand from the word muhtalim? Anyone? Don't feel shy. What do you understand from the word muhtalim? Someone who has gone through puberty. Okay, good. So I was actually going to initially translate this as ala kulli muhtalim, as bathing on the day of Friday is wajib on any individual that has reached puberty. So if I translate it that way, that would include females. But muhtalim is actually zahir concerning males in particular. Because muhtalim comes from ihtilam. Ihtilam is to basically have a dream at night, sexual dream resulting in emission of money. This is ihtilam. Women can have ihtilam as well. But ihtilam is particularly associated with males as a sign of puberty, unlike hayd. Hayd is the primary sign of puberty for women. And so the zahir of this is that kulli muhtalim means every adult male. Okay, so with this hadith, I just want to look at how some of the interpreters, how some of the shurah have commented on this. First, we'll be taking a look at Kitab Ikhtilaf al-Hadith of Imam Shafi'i himself. This is published separate from Al-Umm. It's also published as part of Al-Umm. It's part of Al-Umm in the authoritative, in the critical edition of Rifat Fawzi. This is in volume 10. There's a book called Ikhtilaf al-Hadith, where it deals with reconciling seemingly conflicting hadith. So Imam Shafi'i, he begins by saying, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us, إِذَا قُمْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ, whenever you stand up for prayer, فَاغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ إِلَى الْمَرَافِقِ وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ وَأَرْجُلِكُمْ وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ. Imam Shafi's preferred reading is وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ with fath, as he says elsewhere in his in فدلت السنة على أن الوضوء من الحدث. Says this and the sunnah also indicates that wudu is done. So the Quran told us when we pray to make wudu. Then the sunnah indicated, this is something he will have explained elsewhere, either inside of Ikhtilaf al-Hadith or generally in his writings. He's discussed this when discussing these rulings. The sunnah has indicated that wudu is done when hadith happens. Hadith are basically what are known as the nullifiers of wudu. So there are specific ahdath, specific nawaqid that nullify the wudu. You need to make wudu at the time of prayer. Based on this ayah, in conjunction with the sunnah makes it clear that the command in this ayah is obligatory when you are in fact have done something that broke your wudu. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, لا تقربوا الصلاة وأنتم سكارى حتى تعلموا ما تقولون. Do not approach prayer when you are drunk until you know what you are saying, until you are in your senses. ولا جنبا, nor while you are in a state of janaba, except if you're just passing through the masjid. حتى تغتسلوا, until you have bathed. So it says, therefore wudu is general in the book of Allah concerning all ahdath. And Allah's command to the junub to bathe when he's in a state of janaba is an evidence, and Allah knows best, that it is not obligatory to do ghusl except from janaba. Unless the sunnah were to indicate that there is another ghusl, another type of bath that is wajib, in which case we would make it obligatory based on the sunnah, in obedience to Allah who has commanded us to follow the sunnah. So this indicates that bathing from janaba is obligatory, and I don't know of any clear evidence that there is any other ghusl that is wajib other than janaba. Al-wujub alladhi wajib in the sense, in which sense? Al-wujub alladhi la yujzi'u ghayruhu. So he says that, why is he saying this? Because the term wajib actually has more than one sense. He says wujub in the sense that nothing else is sufficient. This meaning, I don't know of any evidence to support it. At least not any clear evidence. And we'll see what, basically he's referring to the hadith that we just read. So he goes on to say, وَقَدْ رُوِيَ فِي غُسْلِ يَوْمِ الْجُمْعَةِ شَيْءٌ فَذَهَبَ ذَاهِبٌ إِلَى غَيْرِ مَا قُلْنَا وَلِسَانُ الْعَرَبِ وَاسِعٌ. Says that it has been reported, there are reports concerning bathing for the day of Friday, and so some have said other than what we expressed here. وَلِسَانُ الْعَرَبِ وَاسِعٌ. But the language of the Arabs is vast. I think it's open to interpretation. Remember, we said it's important to take note of when interpreting a text, determining what is the possible meanings. What are the possible meanings? And this is a very important point. A person might read this hadith today, the hadith that we read, says wajib. It's explicit. Not being aware that the word wajib could in fact be used in other ways. And so it's not necessary that it indicates a binding obligation. Likewise, it's worth noting that because we are removed 1400 years from the time of revelation in the language in which the Quran was revealed, what may seem to you to be apparent, it does not mean that this was actually what was the apparent meaning. So, that requires deep knowledge of the Arabic language, such that you reach a point where your knowledge of the Arabic language is such that that you understand it the way that Arabs at the time of revelation understood it. So then, Al-Rabi'a, who's the transmitter of Imam Shafi's books, reports, Shafi reported to us from Sufyan, from Zuhri, from Salim, from his father, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man ja'a minkum ila al-jum'ah falyaghtasil." Whoever comes to Jum'ah, then let him bathe. Then he mentioned the other hadith. This is also Imam Shafi reporting. Ghusl al-Jum'ah, Ghusl yawm al-Jum'ah wajib ala kulli muhtalim. The hadith that we had read. So Imam Shafi comments, فاحتمل واجب لا يجزئ غيره. It's possible that he means wajib, such that nothing else will take its place. In other words, a binding obligation. Wajibun fil akhlaq, something that is wajib in the sense of akhlaq. It's wajib in the sense, it's something that is emphasized, it's something that is emphatic as good manners. Wajib fil ikhtiyar, something that is emphatic as a matter of choice. It's something that you have a choice in, but it is emphasized. وفي النظافة ونفي تغير الريح عند اجتماع الناس. It's something that is needed for the sake of cleanliness and to eliminate any bad smell when you're coming to a public gathering. Just as a man might say to another man. So now he's resorting to what? He's resorting to linguistic possibilities, looking at what are the linguistic possibilities of this text. Just as a man might say to another man, وَجَبَ حَقُّكَ عَلَيَّ إِذْ رَأَيْتَنِي مَوْضِعًا لِحَاجَتِكَ. Your right is now binding on me. It is now, emphatic on me, given that you have seen me as you have seen, given that you have seen fit to come to me to deal with, to fulfill your need. So he's saying that basically, this doesn't actually mean that the person is saying it's actually an obligation on me that I do this. He's saying, no, you honored me. You had enough respect for me to come to me thinking that I would take care of your needs. I consider this now a matter of honor that I must fulfill what you have sought from me. فكان هذا أولى معنييه لموافقة ظاهر القرآن في عموم الوضوء من الأحداث وخصوص الغسل من الجنابة والدلالة أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم في غسل يوم الجمعة أيضا. So he says, this second interpretation is the more likely interpretation because it agrees with the apparent meaning of the Quran that wudu is required for hadith and ghusl in particular is required for janaba. So first he's taking this from the Quran. والدلالة عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم في غسل يوم الجمعة أيضا, and also because we have indications from the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم about what is the actual ruling of bathing on يوم الجمعة. فإن قال قائل فاذكر الدلالة. If someone were to say, okay, so then tell us what is that? What is the indication? He then reports this hadith. دخل رجل من أصحاب رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم المسجد يوم الجمعة وعمر بن الخطاب يخطب. So a companion entered the masjid on the day of Jum'ah while Umar ibn al-Khattab was giving khutbah. So Umar said, what time is it? Why are you entering now? It's late. So he said, Oh Amir al-Mu'mineen, I was coming from the marketplace and I heard the adhan. فما زدت على أن أتوضأ. So I simply, made wudu and came. Umar said, not only late, but you also just suffice with making wudu. وقد علمت أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم كان يأمر بالغسل, and you know that the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم used to command ghusl. This is a hadith that is a famous hadith, is reported by Imam Malik and Mu'awwal and others. Shafi says, so when we know that Umar and Uthman both knew that the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم used to command ghusl on Yawm al-Jumu'ah, and Umar mentioned that both he and Uthman are aware of this. And so this eliminates the possibility that we might suppose that they forgot that the Prophet ﷺ had commanded this, as Umar mentioned it in that context. He mentioned it in such a fashion that makes it clear that both of them know this. And yet he didn't actually bathe, nor did Uthman at that point. Uthman is the person in the story. His particular narration doesn't mention it, but it's mentioned in the narrations. And Uthman did not go out at that point to bathe, meaning to go out and fulfill the obligation and come back. Nor did Umar command him with that, nor any of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ who were present, who knew that the Prophet ﷺ had made this command, either because they were aware of it directly from the Prophet ﷺ or because they heard it from Umar when they're having this discussion. This indicates that Umar and Uthman were understood that the command of the Prophet ﷺ was what is recommended, al-ahab, what is preferred, la al-ijab, not that it is an obligation that without it, your obligation is not fulfilled. So he says, then the same is true for those who heard the discussion between Umar and Uthman. And then he goes on to say, and Aisha reports concerning the command to bathe on Yawm al-Jumu'ah, كان الناس عمال أنفسهم. People used to work in their fields for themselves. They didn't have employees they didn't have people to work for them, and so they would come as they are. They would come to the prayer as they are. فقيل لهم لو اغتسلتم. In other words, they would come and they were having sweated all day. They would be smelling, and so it was said to them, لو اغتسلتم, if you make ghusl, that would be good. And then he mentions it's the Basriyin have a hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man tawadda'a fa biha wa ni'mat wa man ightasala fa al-ghusl afdal." They have an explicit hadith. Whoever does wudu, then that's good and great. And whoever does ghusl, that's even better. Al-ghusl afdal. And then he goes on to say, وقولوا أكثر من لقيت من المفتيين اختيار الغسل يوم الجمعة وهم يرون أن الوضوء يجزئ منه. Majority of whom the muftis that I've met prefer ghusl on Yawm al-Jumu'ah, and they're of the view that wudu is sufficient. And so finally he concludes, he says, the hadith of Ibn Umar, this hadith that he mentioned in the beginning, Man ja'a minkum al-Jumu'ah, whoever of you comes to Jumu'ah, فَلْيَغْتَسِلْ. Whoever of you comes to Jumu'ah, meaning whoever of you comes to the Jumu'ah prayer, because that's a Zahir here, that whoever comes to the Jumu'ah prayer, then let him bathe. He says this also indicates that bathing on Jumu'ah is not wajib. It's not wajib in the sense of it's not a binding obligation such that it would be a requirement that you have to do it. Because if it was, it would be an obligation for everyone, whether they come to Jumu'ah or not. Because the statement of the Prophet ﷺ, whoever you comes to Jumu'ah, then let him bathe, indicates that there's no bath required of the one who doesn't come to Jumu'ah. Okay, so I have some other okay, I guess we'll just look quickly at al-Istidkar, the comment, one of the two commentaries of Muwatta by Imam Ibn Abd al-Barr. He says the apparent meaning of these hadiths, again talking about the Zahir, the apparent meaning of these hadiths is that this is wajib in the sense of being a binding obligation. He says, وَلَا أَعْلَمُ أَحَدًا أَوْجَبَ غُسْلَ الْجُمْعَةِ فَرْضًا إِلَّا أَهْلَ الظَّاهِرِ. And I don't know of anybody who made this a binding obligation, a fard, except for the Zahiris. They made this an obligation, and they considered the person who deliberately leaves it off has disobeyed Allah, is sinful. Although they still allow this person to perform Salat al-Jum'ah without ghusl, they consider it valid. And their evidence is the apparent meaning of these hadiths. However, he says the intended meaning is not the apparent meaning. And this is based on ad-dala'il al-mujiba al-ikhrajaha an al-zahir, based on the evidences that show that zahir, that apparent meaning, is not the one that is the meaning that is intended. So then he mentions that same hadith. Whoever comes to Jumu'ah and makes wudu, that's good. Whoever makes ghusl, then that is better. He reports this hadith from Abu Sa'id al-Khudri. He says, look, this is Abu Sa'id, the same person he's the same Sahabi who reported the hadith that ghusl al-Jumu'ah is wajib. He's also reporting this hadith. He says, this clearly indicates that the ghusl of Jumu'ah is a fadila. It's a virtuous act, but it's not an obligation. And so basically this is wajib fil akhlaq al-karima wa husn al-mujalasa. Basically this is etiquette. It's etiquette. It's good etiquette. And then he goes on to say something similar to what Imam Shafi had said. He also makes an interesting point. There is a narration from Abu Hurairah that he says the ghusl of Jumu'ah is like the ghusl of Janaba, which is used by some scholars to justify that actually this is an obligation. So he makes the way of this. He says that's not what Abu Hurairah means. Abu Hurairah doesn't mean that it's an obligation like the ghusl of Janaba. He means that when you perform the ghusl of Jumu'ah, the sunnah is to perform the full ghusl the same way that you would for Janaba. So he's saying that the comparison he was making was not concerning obligation, it was concerning the manner in which it's performed. I guess that's an interesting point. He makes some other points. I'll just mention this from Imam Ibn al-Arabi al-Maliki in his commentary on al-Muwatta called al-Qabas. The same arguments are found in his longer commentary called al-Masalik. This is a very short commentary, and then he has a very lengthy one. In the short one, he says that some people were deluded by these words. He's quoted the hadith a little bit differently, but he says some people were, and I think basically he's just writing from himself, quoting by meaning. Or maybe there's another narration. In any case, he quotes the same narration, this one, and then he quotes another one that is essentially the same meaning. It says some were deluded by. He says a group that fell short, meaning they didn't exert proper effort to properly understand these hadiths. they were deluded by the meaning of these hadiths, or by the wording of these hadiths. They thought that bathing on Yom al-Jumu'ah is an obligation based on the apparent meaning of these hadiths, whereas the reality is that that's not the case. It's a sunnah mu'akkada. It's an emphasized sunnah. It's an emphatic sunnah. That's the meaning of wajib here. It's an emphatic sunnah. Something that is emphatic. It's not something that is binding and you'll be sinful. Ashhab, one of the students of Malik, says, I said to Malik, غسل يوم الجمعة واجب. The ghusl on the day of Jumu'ah is wajib. So Imam Malik responds, ليس كل ما جاء في الحديث يكون هكذا. Imam Malik says to him, look, not everything that is reported in the hadith, you just take it just like that. ليس كل ما جاء في الحديث يكون هكذا. So Ibn al-Arabi, he comments, هذا كلام مجمل بديع على عادة السلف. These are very brief words, but they're excellent, as is often the case with the words of the Salaf. As they would say things in a very brief fashion without going on and going into detail, but with pointing out excellent meanings. And so basically what Imam Malik is saying here is, look, don't rush to take this hadith at what you think is its zahir. You have to know the full context and all the other evidences. And so then he says that, there's 5 arguments for why this is incorrect. The first one he reports that concerning the meaning of the word wajib. Wajib means saqit, that something falls down. This is like in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about slaughtering camels, إِذَا وَجَبَتْ جُنُوبُهَا فَكُلُوا مِنْهَا. When they fall on their sides, after you slaughter, basically it's creating this image of the camel being slaughtered and then collapsing. It says, once that has happened, once the slaughter is complete, then eat from it. So wajaba means for something to fall. So he says that this is the meaning of wajib. This is the linguistic meaning of wajib. So he says that this could be, so the idea is that when something falls and hits the earth, it becomes, fixed in its place. And so the idea of something being wajib, being an obligation, is the same way that which is fallen on the earth with a thud, that it's basically fixed in its place now, that this is similar to the idea of something being binding. This is going to stick to you. Or it could also simply mean that it is really emphatic. So he said that this could mean this fara'id, and it could also apply to sunnah, meaning in the original linguistic usage. Otherwise, obviously, in a fiqh book, the term wajib is going to be used with the istilahi meaning. It's going to be used with the technical meaning. And so this is something you have to be careful of. Don't rush to interpret the Quran and Sunnah based on the terminology of later ulama. Look at what do the words actually originally mean in the Arabic language. Then he mentions the hadith, ghusl is better. Then he mentions this hadith about the virtue of the reward for attending Jum'ah. It says, "Man tawadda'a yawm al-Jum'ah fa ahsin al-wudu' thumma rah." The one who makes wudu yawm al-Jum'ah, makes his wudu excellent, and then goes and listens and does not speak idle talk, his sins will be forgiven. This hadith also indicates that this virtue is promised to the person who makes an excellent wudu and goes. It indicates that ghusl is not actually necessary. Ghusl is for a purpose, for a need. Then he mentions the incident with Umar and Uthman. And he says that basically the fact that they all sort of agreed to this and concurred is clearly an indication that this is how they all had understood it. And then finally he says, the fact that the Prophet ﷺ, his command to bathe was due to a specific reason, as reported by Aisha, the same hadith of Aisha that we mentioned before. And he mentions another narration that says they used to wear wool. And so because of the wool that they were wearing, after they would be working, they would come and it would have a bad smell. And Nasa'i has in a narration, they would be dirty and bad smell would be coming from them. And so it would be a nuisance to the people who were around them. So that was when the Prophet ﷺ gave the instructions for ghusl. So he says that she made clear that the reason for the ghusl, the illah for the ghusl, and so ghusl is tied to it. And absolute obligations are not tied to ilal. They're not tied to an illah, a cause, a legal cause that is sometimes comes and sometimes goes. The reason for this command is due to people needing to bathe to be clean and smell and eliminate bad smell. But not everyone actually needs to do that. And so knowing how this command came to be, we then understand that this is not something that is intended as a permanent obligation. The permanent obligation is not something that would be legislated because some people need it. Some people are in need of it and others are not. So in any case, he's saying that all of these are indications that this Zahir is not intended. Okay. All right. So this example and these passages that we've read, they serve to illustrate this process of ta'wil and the sort of process that ulama go through in looking at other evidences, textual evidences, interpreting the text themselves and the possibilities that are present in the text, and looking at qara'in in order to arrive at a proper interpretation, even if that interpretation is not the Zahir. I mean, the interpretation that they're taking is not the Zahir. This is called ta'wil. Okay, so let's conclude with that. And anyone have any questions real quickly? Okay. All right. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. صلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد.